interfaces. I guess it's time we can get started. Over to you guys.
Yep. Also, ever since we moved remote, it seems like they've embraced kind of being able to work on the East Coast from the Midwest. So a lot of opportunities everywhere working at your computer. So, so thank you all for coming. Hope traffic wasn't too bad, and I hope the pizza is good. Me and Nick today are going to be presenting on a cloud-native approach to Azure migration. And so first, I know we've kind of introduced ourselves, but for the people online as well, my name is Julian Peffer. I graduated from UNO with a degree in computer science about 3-4 years ago. I was hired thereafter at Sageti Capgemini, where I was put onto a client that was sort of in the process of their migration, where we were working in a hybrid on-prem environment. And so I'm hoping through that experience I can share some insights on my thoughts and how that went. And
thank you all once again for coming to this presentation. We'll try to justify it as much as possible for your drive. If not, the pizza should be good. I have been a developer for 5 years now. I completed my master's in information systems in 2018 from Murray State, Kentucky. Did jobs here and there, and then was hired in 2020 by Sageti. So with that, I give it to Julian to start us or kick us off.
So in this presentation, we're going to be covering an overview of what is cloud-native architecture and what is lift and shift, the opposite sort of cloud-native architecture. Then Nick is going to go into IaaS versus PaaS versus SaaS, and for some of you, that's just going to be an overview or jogging your memory. But then we're going to go into some practical advantages of IaaS versus PaaS versus SaaS, and what are some of Azure cloud offerings. And then Nick is going to talk a bit about security and networking, and then I'm going to wrap it up with lift and shift versus cloud native, living in a mixed environment like I did at my client, and maybe some practical guidance. And at any point, any questions, any points of discussion, feel free to stop me. All right, so what is lift and shift? Lift and shift is when you have your resources on premise and you take them without many modifications and put them in the cloud. Think of something like taking your virtual machine, making a clone of it, and making a virtual machine in Azure. It's pretty much the same thing as what it was, but now maybe you connect to it differently. But now it's in the cloud, it's off your hardware at least. I often think of the monolith application that is now in the cloud, so the VB.NET application that's new again. But then we have what is cloud native? Cloud native is when you take a step back and look at, for example, your VM and you re-architect that. Maybe you take an application off, you plug it off and make an Azure function. You break apart what's on that VM into specific components in the cloud. It's really completely designing and building your Azure solution using a cloud-based approach. So using the resources Azure provides. And so we have a bit of a thesis statement here, because when I first started doing this research for this presentation, and I reached out to leaders in our company, and I asked them about this subject, and what their thoughts on it was sort of like when I was first hired as a developer, and I touched my first VB.NET application that had a 6,000 line switch statement that was really gross, and I was like, I go to my senior developer and I tell him, why don't we just rewrite this, right? It's kind of naive to think that, to sit here and just shell for cloud native, because there's a lot of reasons that you can't just cloud native your company. It's going to be a mixture, almost always a mixture of lift and shift and cloud native if you're an existing company. And it's never black and white. It's very dependent on your organization. And there's different perspectives to look at it from. There's the business and the developer's perspectives. And so really what we do is we hope to leave you with some tools and insights to recognize the patterns for your migration strategy, and hope to at least help you understand some pros, cons, benefits of cloud native versus lift and shift. And I'm going to pass it off to Nick, who's now going to go into IaaS versus PaaS versus SaaS.
Thank you, Julian. So I'm sure many of you here have very much good idea about what infrastructure as services and platform as a service and software as a services. But let's just jog our memories down a bit, right? So if you're on-prem or a private cloud like Rackspace, you manage every of all these instances, right? But let's say you started to say, you know what, I don't really want to manage all of this. I would like to give that data or that responsibility to a cloud provider, cloud provider, and then you can say, okay, the first step in that would be to just get the infrastructure part of it. So your computing, networking, and storage, right? You're like, sweet, this is nice. Maybe we can step it up a bit more. And the next up level would be the platform as a service, which also gives you runtime operation virtual machine. The big caveat in this is you are still responsible for configuring them. They're just providing you the hardware or the tools for that, in an essence, to speak of, right? And then we then step a little bit more, and we fully go into cloud providers that would be their software as a service, which gives you applications and runtimes. So let's dive a little bit into an example of what these are, because we just were trying to talk about this. So talking about what an infrastructure as service is. So the cloud provider does provide you with, server storage, a physical data server, and your firewall networking, right? So the best example would be an Azure VM. And you might be wondering, wait, VMs? But you said those are PaaS, not SaaS. What I mean is that you do get your VMs as within to configure for you as a part of this. So does anyone have an example for, we're trying to keep it as interactive. Does anyone have another example for infrastructure as service?
In Azure?
It could be AWS, could be Google Cloud Provider, doesn't have to be Azure, but I think we covered everything.
I think what we are doing recently is maybe it's a kind of infrastructure as a service. So everyone might have heard about the tool called DBT, data build tool. It's a kind of transformation tool, especially works with Snowflake. So basically, we want to spin up our build is a new team that we are building, and we want to come up with our own infrastructure and everything. I mean, infrastructure in essence, environments.
Yeah.
So what we are just doing is we are just spinning up VMs with the available free image. I think it's Ubuntu based, 3 years free.
Yeah.
Then they charge. So on that we are configuring everything. Once Ubuntu is coming with the basic version, then by using the package installers, we are installing MailX and a couple of things. Then installing Python, DBT, and all. So I mean, it's a kind of infrastructure as a service.
Yeah, it sure is. So yeah, thank you. That was a good example. We can move into the.
Another good example is just a file share, right?
Yeah.
You got a huge file share. Maybe go to Azure and get a blob storage or table storage. We get the disk space, move all the data to there. That's it. We configure it.
Yeah.
We kind of doing.
Yeah, but with file share, if you have huge amount of data, that does, migrating that would require some other tools that we will go into Azure migration tools later down the line. But you are right, sir. There. Moving on to PaaS. The best example that I can give for PaaS is Azure Functions. What I mean by that is that you have event triggers, let's say, depending on what your application is doing or your software wants to do. You would use a Azure function to write a small, basically if this then that, right? So that's what your Azure functions would come down to. Any examples if you want to throw in? If not,
I can give an example.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, sir.
So basically, the way that we are using Azure Functions is a broad, right? I mean, it's
it
kind
is.
of lambdas kind of thing.
Yeah.
So the way that we are using in our environment, right? So we want to call these DBT scripts through ADF.
Okay.
Right? Azure Data Factory.
Yeah.
So we don't have webhooks. Right?
Okay.
So the way that we are doing is we wrote some small Python program which is going to do SSH to a server with the parameters and all. and we integrated that one into the Azure function and calling that to media.
Cool. So you're essentially doing a trigger for your Python script so that it can.
Right.
Sweet.
I think it all boils down to the level of management.
Yep.
If it is owned by a cloud provider or by consumer.
Yeah.
Most of the managed services are PaaS.
Mhm.
Azure Functions Service is a good example.
Yeah.
It could be Azure App Services, Azure SQL.
SQLs, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, since I'm from database world, we are migrating all of our SQL Server, this thing, right? I mean, on-prem SQL Server into SQL DB, the PaaS environment. And yeah, there also we got a lot of challenges, right? Anything with the linked server, we have an on-prem, we have SQL database running with the from basically the data warehouse pointing to multiple link. When we go to Azure SQL DB, it doesn't like.
Yep.
Right? I mean, an example, but SQL DB is another just an example.
And
Yeah.
SQL is a good example because you can run a SQL server on a virtual machine, which
Mhm.
would be an IIS.
Yeah.
Where you need to do things like link servers
Mhm.
and all those
Yeah,
things.
yeah, yeah.
But if you just want to run plain database, you
That's
can
it.
run it on a managed PaaS offering called
Sure.
Azure SQL.
Yeah.
SQL.
If you don't like Azure Data Hub or Data Factory, yes, you can go down that route. That is
Yeah.
nice.
We didn't go to the managed instance yet, SQL managed instance, but we just go to SQL DB. Just migrating a lot of data.
The another example I think I would throw in as a service bus too, with the eventing and the queuing and topics are also good PaaS examples. So moving on to the next one, which would be SaaS. So at this point, you threw all your hands in the air and said, Lord, take the wheel. So you have migrated over to completely using cloud services or cloud provided services. So the best example would be Azure DevOps, the whole CI/CD pipeline, right? You can have the configuration. It packages your software, exe or PV files, whatever you need, dumps it onto a build. Depends on what you do with it. You want to do a Docker container, you want to do a Kubernetes container, whatever you want, goes all the way to the data center. So that's a good example of a SaaS. So there you're only managing the data and the access of it. Rest is all handled by your cloud provider, right?
And when you say data and access, you manage it still resides in the cloud
Yeah.
provider's data center.
Yeah, yeah,
And another example could be Microsoft 365 suite, all the Office applications.
Yep.
You can access them on browser and you can do everything.
yeah. Power BI
PowerPoint.
is a wonderful tool, right? For especially for business partners that don't like. It also goes into low code, no code kind of situation there.
Yeah, Power
So
Platform is
yeah.
a good example.
yeah.
And can I mean, I'm just asking, can it say like a Snowflake, Salesforce, Workday? I mean, even though they're all like a different
Yeah.
company, I mean, they're running on Azure or environment, right?
Yeah.
So this we can call them as a SaaS. I mean,
Yes, yeah. No, I mean, at the end of the day, they're coming from different providers, but we still are essentially mostly giving the work or the, your company is not hiring a lot more developers just for configuration
I
purposes.
think they
So-
offer both SaaS flavor as well as your own hosted flavor where you can host it in your own cloud.
Right.
Or you can also run it in their own hosted environment and use it as SaaS.
like computing resource maybe coming from Snowflake, then I mean, then disk or go back to.
Yeah, that's the best part. They've given you an option whether you want to run it in our cloud or
Okay.
your own cloud, and then you can choose.
Gmail is the best example.
Gmail.
Yeah, that is true.
365.
Yeah, Gmail Suite 365, any of those ones. So with that being said, now I want to delve into Azure security, because now that you have given all your access to, let's say, or all your things to the cloud provider, you want to make sure that it is safe and secure. How would you know? So diving into this, as you can see, Azure security offer a lot of things like network access control, remote access, cross-premise connectivity. But I think the ones you would really like if you're doing lift and shift kind of architecture would be the Azure networking, the firewall, and the parameter network, which is the DMZ. Especially the architecture for DMZ is very useful if you have a hybrid solution, right? You have service on-prem, but you still need to use VMs or other stuff that Azure provides you. and I really like their DDoS protection. One of the best. Well, one of the best. So there is AWS and GCP to compete too, but according to the research I did, and I saw DDoS protection from Azure does really is better than AWS's one. So let's take a look example of what a normal Azure virtual network would look like. So this is your virtual network. You have your subnets, right? And your subnets do have your VMs, and your subnets are configured using your network security groups. I'm not going to go too deep or detailed into this because we will be here just discussing about network security groups and what you can do with subnets, and because we can add spokes to this, load balancers, and this becomes a networking tool or a tutorial at that point. But essentially, you have your VNet. Let's say your VMs don't need a forward-based like a HTTP access, right? So you don't have to give them that network security group or that network rule. You just filter for RDP or SSH, and you have, like you're saying with your Python, you can just do the SSH or RDP into it to run the script that you need from Azure Cloud. So this is just an example of that. Moving into, so the reason I was going here is because the next step would be talking about the firewall, which would be sitting in front of your virtual network. So let's step into Azure Firewall. So as you can see, that is a very high level architecture of what an Azure Firewall will offer to you for your VNets or your WANs, right? And that does give you a lot of filtration from level L3 to L7. You might be wondering what were level 3, L3 to L7? When we were doing our education, I believe we were told about the networking infrastructure model. There was SI model, which goes over physical layer, data layer, transport layer, and all the way to application layer. Now, you guys might be wondering, well, I want a little bit more protection for L1 and L2 too. I want dedicated protections. Azure does offer them. Mainly the government uses it. The US government, the military, DARPA, IRS also uses it. And that's when you actually see, if you go to the Azure status, you see your US East, US West all online. There's a little tab that talks about the government sites also. So those are the servers that actually give you all from L1 to L7 protections. But that does require you to get some more, shield some more money for them because it's a bit more, right? Yeah, so the best examples for this would be how your firewall would be protecting you from any undesired traffic, because let's be clear, let's be honest, we're going to blacklist everything and only whitelist the things we need, right? So let's say you only need to whitelist port 8260 for SSH. This is an example. So you would just open that port. That would be going through your spoke, which sits in front of your VMs, which virtual networks, which then talk to your. You can have many virtual networks on a spoke, right? And your on-prem will directly have a port open, so you're protecting your on-prem servers or database servers too, using Azure Firewall. Does anyone have any questions, concerns?
So do you have a slide on NSG also?
No. Do you want me to go into that?
No, when I was starting, I was always confused between a network security group and firewall.
Oh, yeah.
Because when I was just starting, I always thought you can set firewall rules in firewall, and you can also set networking rules in NSG. So in which case should I use NSG? In which case should I use Azure Firewall?
So,
I mean, and I'm speaking when I was just starting, and I said, hey, why don't you go and use NSG? And I was like, what is NSG and how is it different from firewall?
yeah, so maybe like if we really wanted to discuss that in layman terms, firewall could be your compound wall on a perimeter, right? Perimeter wall for your property, let's say. And then NSGs would be your ID card access to your different rooms in your perimeter.
That's a good
That's-
point. It depends on what scope you're applying. it
Yeah,
for,
yeah,
and-
yeah. That too. Like you can give a NSG that says, okay, you will allow port 80, port 443, port 80 for HTTP, 443 for HTTPS, and 22 for, let's say, SSH, because that's the default ports, right? Then you can apply it to all of your network that is there. But then you can have, as I was saying in the previous slide, let's say your spoke 2 doesn't need to have port 80 and port 443 and just needs port 22. You just apply to that. So your firewall will allow all those 3 ports, but your spoke 2 will only allow port 22, if that.
Also, the main difference, firewall works at the endpoint level.
Yeah.
And
Or the start point, your ingress.
where you end.
Yeah, yeah.
NSG is right, like it is around the virtual machine.
Yep.
So if there is no firewall, if someone sneak in, yeah, you can protect your VM.
Yep.
But within your virtual net,
Yeah.
whatever it is exposed, they can still access it.
Yeah. Well, yes, right. Because without firewall, you're essentially opening up your whole virtual network out.
Exactly.
Yeah. So.
If they can do a random checks, right? Like with the endpoints,
Yep.
it's called a bridge, I think, like a junction. So usually, right, like a google.com/gmail/drives and all those things
Yeah.
are there, right? They just can try. I mean, they can say like they don't know. Okay, Gmail is blocked. Then they can try /drive.
Yeah.
If there is no firewall and if that NSG is not protected on the drive,
Yep.
they can get in.
Yeah.
All the URL-based routing can be handled
Through
firewall.
Yeah, through firewalls.
And
And
firewalls or gateways.
the
Because NSGs is nothing but a set of rules that you
Yeah,
can define.
just a filtration
rules and
system.
Ports and traffics, and you can define what are those. You cannot specify, right?
inbound, outbound
Labels
rules.
as well now. What labels? What are those called? You can define subnet to subnet traffic is allowed.
The filtration system for within internal networking.
That is kind of ingress control.
Yeah, ingress and egress configurations. I was thinking about, since you're saying who can get in without a firewall, the best penetration tool there is called Nmap. You can just use Nmap on a Kali Linux and point it out to any domain. You will get all the open ports on a network. I did it for a company while I was interviewing for them. They had even their print servers open to the worldwide.
What is that tool?
Nmap.
Nmap?
Yeah, it's a Kali Linux internal tool
Is
that.
it open source?
Yeah, it is very much open source. So yeah, just Nmap and use your google.com also works fine. Or your IP address, and it should give you the whole list of ports open. With that being said, so also Azure Firewalls offers a lot of threat intelligence based filtration, and you might be wondering how are they doing that, and that's when you step into Microsoft Sentinel. So what is Microsoft Sentinel? It's just a data acquisition, big data acquisition from a lot of threat websites that they have. They collect, they respond, and they detect, also investigate. So Microsoft spends about $1 billion yearly for this, and you might be. I know we are all Azure group here, so I'm pretty sure we're on the Azure camp. But if the business is anyone like, why should I just choose Azure? Why can't I go with GCP or like AWS, right? Azure has best in class certifications, as they have more certifications from ISO, IRS, and all the other big trusted sets out there. So there's a comprehensive list on Azure website that you can go. I think I have a link somewhere in the notes here we can go to.
Sentinel is great. It's a CM tool from Microsoft, and
Yeah.
our last session was on Sentinel, where we had a roundtable discussion with the speakers were talking about how they were logging billions of signals every day,
Yeah.
and how they logged all those signals for a month or two, and then they started analyzing those signals. to identify all the different security gaps in their different systems, and it was just not Azure services which were sending the logs. It was all the Microsoft 365 services, all other third-party vendor tools that they were using. They were hooking one by one all of them to Sentinel. And that was the point I think we were trying to make.
Yes.
It can be used outside of Azure too. It's basically a single tool.
Yeah.
So.
Just a quick question. I mean, like, what is the difference between Sentinel and Defender? I mean, like, Microsoft is giving Defender also, right? And it's kind of a signature-based security tool.
So this is a CM. This is security information, and even the platform you can send your logs into this. This is a logging platform. That is a security endpoint security platform. And Defender is very vast. Earlier there used to be different offerings. One was Security Center, then they rebranded it as Microsoft Defender. And there were different security pieces across different pieces, even for Microsoft 365. I'm not a security expert, but Defender is a complete security suite, and this is just a CM tool.
So this kind of threat analysis tool.
This
It's more than threat analysis. It does actually detect. You can collect the data and also it responds.
So basically you are sending all your signals from your different systems into Sentinel, and it gives you visualizations where you can go and investigate and analyze those signals to understand what's happening in your system.
So all the data that is flowing through, you can just log it here.
I mean, the Defender, right? We have a Microsoft Defender, we defined the baseline. So what, like a SQL DB, especially DBA SQL database, what are things we need to baseline, we define it. And
you can define the security baselines using Defender.
Yeah, Defender, and then based on the baseline, it doesn't alert. If it is not in that certain baseline, it will send an alert to us.
Isn't it that offering for SQL called Defender for SQL is a separate offering?
Well, it was it's Microsoft Defender. We just used the Microsoft Defender. Within that, we brought that SQL DB.
Okay.
Interesting.
And for Sentinel, we collect everything into Azure.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, it also gives you a graphical representation too. It's easy to understand rather than just a.
But one catch here is all the data transfer that happens and the data that goes and resides in Azure. They charge you for that. I think all ingress is free.
Yeah.
But all ingress might be chargeable. So, and that was, I think, was mentioned in our roundtable last month as well.
But also, when you say CM, you mean to say compliance management, right? This one.
Kind of.
Because like all these HIPAA, IRS,
Yeah.
CSA, these are all compliance protocols.
So Sentinel doesn't have all the policies which are specific to these, but Sentinel as a tool comply with all those regulations.
Yeah. They have the certification for that. Like, let's say you're a company that is dealing with a lot of, example, DICE, which is the company that deals with HIPAA laws that Nebraska medicine uses. They use Sentinel too because they have HIPAA certifications. They just have, like the Sentinel tool has certifications. You don't essentially have the compliance. It doesn't make sure that you have compliance. You still have to configure the company.
Yeah, all insurance and health sectors.
Yeah.
Is mandatory to have HIPAA.
Yeah. Moving on to the actual thing I'm excited about, the DMZ architecture of Azure, because let's be honest, if you're a company and you're trying to migrate to cloud, you're not going to start fresh in there, right? You'll definitely be porting over a little bit. So you'll still have your on-prem network or on-prem services like your VMs, your databases, if you don't want to completely port over there. So essentially what this is trying to give you a picture of, high level, is you have your virtual networks with the load balancer there, and you have your VMs on behind the load balancer, and your ingress point would be from Azure Firewall, which is the base station that goes to the firewall, and you want to talk to your VM, like your Python script, for example, has to talk to your VM. So how would if your Python script then, let's say, has to pull data that is on on-prem server, right? How would you do that? You would essentially have a IPsec tunneling to your on-prem server, and you can pull data that way. And this is by DMZ, which is the demilitarized zone, right, that we know of, is demilitarizing your on-prem server from Azure network. So that way you are more not at harm, and you can use Azure's ingress as more protections to your on-prem, and you can route your traffic through Azure. That way you're less exposed to the big bad wolves in the world out there. So this is all well and good. We now know that we want to go to Azure. I have convinced you all to move to Azure, let's say. But you need some tools, right? Because let's be honest, we all would like to go as soon as possible to Azure. So with that, my Azure does offer you some migration tools like Azure Migrate, which use discovery and assessment. This one is really nice because you have a lot of let's say VMware VMs or Hyper-V VMs that are sitting on your on-prem server, and you are not sure if your configuration is good enough to port over. So you can run this tool, and it will give you all the configurations that are mostly compatible, and the changes you need to do for Azure to work natively, or for your VMs to be ported over natively. There is also services for migration and moderation, and there's data migration assistance, which essentially gives you good detailed steps on how to port your SQL servers to Azure SQL Server, so that you have changes. To go into moving on to more tools, there are a lot of big host of things. One of the things I think I really like about is the Azure Data Box. So you have a lot of data on your server. Moving that over IP or over internet is going to take a lot of time. So Azure does offer you a data box service that you can put it on your on-prem, port your data over, and they will then move the data to a server once they take it to a secure location. And the one other thing I like is Movra, which is as a server, which is also a SaaS application platform, right? It gives you all the IT environments that you need for your application or for your software to be ported over. Has anyone used any of these?
I never used Mover. I will maybe check it out. But yeah, Databox is pretty cool. You can order that. They will send you a physical hard drive to your location. Then you can load your data and send it, ship it back to them.
Yeah.
So any idea, like, based on the size, right? I mean, I know we read somewhere. I mean, is it like the data is like this size?
So there are two considerations for data box. One is how big how huge data you have. Is if it's just 100 gigs, you can upload it through your bandwidth. But
like
if it's hundreds of terabytes, then and you have, let's say, running on 10 Mbps or your bandwidth is very low.
Right.
So if you try to upload those terabytes of data on your own over internet or over a private network, it is going to take months, if not years, to upload that. So Databox provides you much cost-effective solution where you can request them. They will send you a hard drive, which is, I think, uses BitLocker encryption. So when you're writing your data on that, it all gets encrypted. And then you ship it back to them. Then their Microsoft employees will take it and then the physical device, and they will hook it up in the data center, and then they will give you access to it, and you can access it in your block storage.
I mean, in the kind of scenario they have to go through some kind of outage, right? I mean, we take the data here and we shut on the server.
There is going to be downtime because you have to ship the data.
Ship the data.
It won't be that you uploaded it here
Yeah,
and
yeah.
it will start showing.
I mean,
Depending upon where you are located,
Yeah.
which data center you are sending it to,
Got it.
might take from days to weeks for your data to
Sure,
show
sure.
up there.
and I would
Plan.
think you wouldn't shut it down as soon as you ship it, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So
And there might always be, if your data is real time and like, there might always be a delta
Yeah.
between the time
Mhm.
when you get
Ship the data and then.
Yeah. So Azure migration tools are well and good, but let's say you have a configuration that is not very out of the box for Azure, then Terraform is your best friend. With Terraform, you can create copies of your VM which are on your on-prem. You can create your virtual networks with energy rules, everything in Terraform, and then upload it onto, or you can just run the Terraform, which is nothing but a YAML file, right? You can run that in Azure Cloud, and it will take all those configurations and make you the VMs and VSGs as you need. In 2018, I was part of a team where I had to migrate some stuff from Rackspace onto Azure. At that time, Azure didn't have all these migration tools that they have now. We did all the legwork in Terraform. So the big asterisk that I was trying to say is that you have to do the legwork on all that, but you have the tools to do it if you don't really want to use the migration tools.
Just a quick question. So Terraform is owned by
HashiCorp.
right?
Yeah.
So what is the difference between Terraform and HashiCorp's
Oh,
Azure?
The good thing about HashiCorp is that the Terraform is mostly open source. But if you don't want to do the legwork of doing the configuration, you can hire them, and they'll give you a web-based application. So you can just give your links, and they will give you the whole configurations that you need. Essentially, it's like Red Hat Linux, right? Linux is open source, but if you want Red Hat to manage, customize and manage.
It's a paid service which comes with a support model.
Yeah.
That we
Yeah.
can consume.
Okay.
Otherwise, I think for Terraform there is no support model.
Yeah.
Go for Terraform.
Yeah, exactly. Terraform Enterprises, I think what they call that.
And also nowadays, I think Azure is suggesting use bicep templates, right? Like you just kind of ARM templates.
Yeah, they are.
So, I mean, is bicep templates? I mean, I don't know. If used or not.
I have never used it.
Bicep is good.
It's good.
I mean, it's more of a question of there are two things that goes into consideration. What is the skill set that your team has, and whether you are single cloud or multi-cloud. So if you are purely Azure play, then maybe using ARM templates or Bicep might make sense. But if you are multi-cloud, maybe training your employees on both cloud formation for AWS and Bicep for Azure, you can train them on Terraform so that they can manage both of your environments. The advantage that I see why I always recommend ARM and Bicep over Terraform if you are a single cloud consumer is because as soon as there is a new service that is released by Microsoft, ARM and Bicep support them from day one. Whereas Terraform being a third-party tool, it takes, if not months, at least weeks before that support is added to Terraform.
To add adapters and all.
Yeah, I mean, because Azure is growing every day, so every day they will add new features. All those features show up in ARM and Bicep almost right on the same day. But that's not the case with Terraform. There is a waiting time because when HashiCorp goes, they understand those features and then incorporate in their provider so that can be on. So that's one of the drawbacks, but Terraform, as I said, is a great tool. It takes away, I mean, he said, if we don't have migration tools, we have to do legwork. But in itself, Terraform is a great tool. You can automate lots of your infrastructure provisioning through Terraform very easily.
Yeah, I used Terraform and also the ARM templates, not the Bicep templates. But yeah, Terraform is very easy compared to.
Bicep is comparatively
easier than ARM.
Terraform, but yeah, I can understand the challenge with ARM templates. The more resources you have in your ARM templates, you are
to go through a big JSON.
JSON, and I think that was the main reason they came up with bicep, because in under the hood bicep, when you compile your bicep templates, they essentially translate into ARM and then they execute. There isn't, Azure Resources doesn't understand bicep code, they all understand only ARM.
Yeah, and also Terraform is open source. The other thing is that Bicep, I believe, is not.
Bicep is part of Microsoft.
Yeah, but Microsoft is still doing some open source.
It's out there in GitHub, so
Yeah.
you can go and contribute
Yeah.
to Bicep
Yeah,
in GitHub.
but at the end of the day, it's still their product. It's
I
not-
mean, you cannot use Bicep for AWS. You can use Terraform for AWS.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, today I was, I mean, like somehow someone from my security admin, they came up with these bicep templates. So I was looking into it. I felt like even with the bicep template, ARM template, I mean, Terraform is better, easier than this. I mean, like,
It's more on skills as well. The more comfortable you are using Terraform or any other tool, I mean, it's difficult to move to another tool unless there is a drastic improvement. Where if you are writing 10 lines in Terraform and Bicep says you just write one line and you are done. You still have to write lines in Bicep. So.
yeah, because like Terraform, I see it as a template language. All you need to do is fill in the blanks and it takes care of the
So you have to understand Bicep was never targeted to compete against Terraform. Bicep was always a solution to attract customers to use ARM templates, because ARM templates, as they were growing, people were getting frustrated. So to address that problem, they came up with Bicep. They never came up with Bicep to compete against Terraform. They wanted to simplify experience of people who don't want to go to a third-party tool and use cloud-native tooling that Microsoft offers.
With that, I would hand it off to Julian, who would be going over cloud native. Julian?
Yeah, that was I learned a lot there. Thanks for the discussions, guys. That's awesome. I'm going to be talking about cloud native and lift and shift. And so to start, why cloud native? Well, one of the things you'll hear is it reduces costs, but why does using the SaaS and PaaS products versus IaaS products reduce costs? And you got to look at it from a developer's perspective. Why do developers want cloud native? I like to think of agility and speed, getting my code out there quickly. I love DevOps. I like the boards. I like the CI/CD as personal preference. Freedom of choice and control. When you're doing the architecting, you get to choose your frameworks, the languages you use for the most part. And then from a business perspective, and if anyone has anything to share on the business perspectives I give, please do. I'm not a business person, so I tried my hardest. One thing is time to market. They like being able to get their products out quickly. Cost optimization, that comes down to the reducing costs of, I think everyone likes saving money. And then global reach, I imagine Azure makes it really easy to deploy anywhere with low latency. And so I want to try to add a new perspective to why cloud native and what you're really doing. So how does SaaS and PaaS reduce costs? Well, what are you really paying for when Azure charges you? Well, you're paying for the electricity that runs through their systems to run your code, your infrastructure, whatever you have out there. And so it's really commoditized electricity. And so SaaS and PaaS reduce costs because it reduces the amount of electricity your stuff needs to run in Azure. By like if you have a VM in Azure, you're constantly running the disks, you're running the operating system. That's all stuff that is running in the background to support whatever application you have on that server or database. While if you use a more cloud native approach, you are going to be reducing the amount of electricity your application specifically needs. There's a lot of ways that happens. One of the big ones is like multi-tenancy, where you're sharing these resources with other people. And so by using PaaS and SaaS, for a lot of products, it just simply reduces the amount of electricity that you are making Azure use to run your code. And that that depends on the area, the region, kilowatt, how much they charge per kilowatt hour in that area, and there's also, you're obviously paying for a lot of the research and development and the, I guess I can't think of the word, but the stuff they own, intellectual property, and there's probably some profit markup somewhere in there, and that's all fair. But I like to think of it in purely just electrons running down wires going through hardware. And so when it comes to cost optimization, using the cloud reduces the amount of electricity you use, and that's because of multi-tenancy, and that's where you're sharing servers with other people. Economy of scale, Microsoft is massive. They have data centers all over. They're able to bargain with local governments and reduce the cost on electricity. They're able to buy hardware in bulk, where a small business or a single user would probably need to pay a lot more for the same stuff. And they have energy efficient infrastructure. They're big data, and they have some of the best in the world working for them. I'm sure they're able to a lot more efficiently manage their infrastructure than a bunch of small businesses. And doing all that, they reduce the costs for you in the long term. And so something else I think developers don't think of enough or talk about enough is in the future, sustainability. I think programming for and architecting for sustainability is something we should really consider. Reducing the amount of electricity your applications use reduces the amount of electricity the power plant needs to generate, which reduces the amount of output that comes from it. And something when we were researching this, Nick brought up was something called Project Natick, and I'm going to give him a few minutes here to talk about it.
Oh, thank you, Julian. So this started when I think in 2018 I was still in college, and one of my projects for a class was to completely design a server, or actually a data center in an open land. That was the end of the day project for us, or end of the semester project for us. Researching for that, I came across Microsoft's Project Natick. What it was doing for sustainability, they put all their essentially a mini data center in a pressurized container and then lowered that container down to 117 feet on the northern Irish Isles. What they saw was significant reduction in heating costs, because as we all know, data centers are really hot. There's a lot of electricity to heat them or cool them down to desired temperatures for them to be running. So that was a success. They did that for 2 years as a proof of concept project, and the significant gains from lower cost of emissions for heating and cooling the data center was well significant enough to say this is a project. On the right side of the screen is the project phase 1. Now they have went into phase 2, where they are essentially doubling the size, actually tripling the size of what the Project Natick phase 1 was doing. The whole point of this is they're trying to see if more latency can be done with networking, and also there are other difficulties that they found in the first POC that are being fleshed out in phase 2. I think I'm really excited for this, because if this is the way to go, we don't have to have data centers on land anymore. It's all going to be with the fishes. So
I wonder how physical security works with that. That someone could theoretically.
I mean, you need to, if you're at 117 feet below, that's for only phase 1. If they are going very deep, you need to have a sub to do that.
Okay, a highly motivated individual. Yeah.
I mean, yes, right now they can also go and cut the the internet cables down on the ground, right? Not in the sea level. That way they can.
It's a very creative solution to bring the cost down, and it again ties back to your cost optimization, where economies of scale comes in. Yeah. I think one of the challenges that I see is on land you can make really big data centers. Yeah. I just don't know how big these tubes can be that can.
Yeah, so if the phase 1 was essentially an oil tanker, and phase 2 they took the oil tanker and multiplied it by 16 or 17 times. So 17 oil tankers altogether connected. And as you can see, there's a subsea cable connections that are going through, and that's how they connected all together. But I mean, it's still under progress. So hopefully that's where I hope we go. But
I think they came up with this solution. I mean, this containerized data centers. Sometime when they started with the project Office Dynamics and all, that is way long back in 2012, 2008 time frame.
Cool. I didn't know that.
I mean, just like you, I was when I heard about this one, I was very interested and I did a little bit of digging in. That is around 1.5 years back.
Okay.
Yeah, but yeah, that is almost like 6-7 years or maybe 10 years back. They tried to do that, but I don't think like it is that much of successful because right, like Google or Facebook, even Amazon, they're not trying that, right? I mean, there is really a lot of cost optimization that's going to benefit. Everyone is going to jump onto the ship, right?
I think there will be certain challenges too. How do you send employees to go to the
Yeah.
under the water?
Yeah, or you need to lift the whole thing up.
I've never done sea diving, so I just don't know how it works. But if you're going to put 100 feet below the water, I mean, that's going to cause them, you need employees who are skilled in diving and they can go down and. But I think when I was watching a video, I think they lift it up
Yep.
off the water. They never send employees inside.
Yeah, because it's a
That's
pressurized
my-
container.
my
You don't
point
get in.
was,
Dangerous, right?
I've worked in support for Azure, so I know when these people work, these data centers are huge, and even if one piece of hardware crashes, they go and replace it manually. So if each tube has, let's say, thousands of servers, and if just one server crashes, are they going to lift it up or they're going to send someone inside?
Not only that, I mean, like if I'm the business owner, I really worry putting my data into those kind of sector because I mean, even today we are. I mean, like if we open CNN, some submersible went into.
What happens if it gets
Yeah,
flooded?
the Titanic.
But what happens if it's half the price?
It just lost control and it just went.
Yeah,
bottom of
but
the ocean.
yes, but at the end of the day, it's not.
I think
There is
they're
actually
still,
all
I
right.
think it's still a pilot project. They're trying to.
Yeah,
figure
it's
out
still in
what
phase
works.
2. You're right. And then what I'm trying to get at is, at the end of the day, it's Azure's problem, not ours. Azure's SLA does give you, which he'll be going into, a lot of uptime.
It is going to benefit consumers too, because if they can bring the electricity cost down for cooling, then they pass on the benefits by reducing the price of the services.
Yes.
And this kind of architecture, right? Even in main, I'll look at like a DR solution, right? There's like a 3 or 2 or 3 DR solution you have, instead of having one DR and LAN,
Yeah.
I'll put it there. Even though I'm.
That addresses the problem he
Yeah,
was saying.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean.
I'm
still
pretty,
like
I'm pretty sure everyone likes data redundancy, and then there will be, I'm sure there are people that are actually metallurgy and chemical engineers and
And there's a detailed video from Ignite
Yeah.
or Build, I think, on this very architecture of what they're trying to do, I think, a couple of years back. That's an interesting video to watch.
Yeah, it's like in YouTube. I mean, it's there.
yeah, it is. I found this funny, and to your point, sir, that why doesn't AWS or Google do it? I think someone once told me in business that you let someone else do the hard work and you just buy the product or acquire the company is what they said. I think that's maybe what they're waiting for. Maybe there's royalties later on. I don't know how Azure works. We can all talk to Satya Nadella if we need
They want
to.
to watch Microsoft make the mistake.
Yeah, yeah,
They want to see one of theirs sink to the bottom and be like, we can't let ours do that.
Yeah.
What can we do better?
that is true. But I like that at least Microsoft lets you play with things. That's a huge amount of money to be sinking into. With also, if you're actually putting real customer data on there, that's also your name and branding on top too. So,
But consumer is risk-free because Microsoft provides SLA.
Yeah.
If anything happens to their data,
yeah,
consumers can sue Microsoft and they can get compensated.
yeah,
There
But
might
again,
be-
it's a mess. If
There
something
might be
happens.
clauses, right? I mean, like, because most of the time when business do the contracts, there will be some clause which is going to be in favor to them because like recently there is a 2 outages on AWS sites in Virginia and also one outage in Azure.
Azure has outages
So
too. Yes.
especially the AWS outage is very costly. That iRobot and all those things they lost. They couldn't work for almost 5-6 hours. Some call centers went down and all. So they might have I didn't hear like they are suing them as AWS.
I've seen the consumers suing Microsoft for similar outages, but what happens is the case gets settled at a very low award money than what the consumers have been asking, because what consumers will say, hey, we lost $million in these 3 hours. But what Microsoft will come back and say, oh, whatever we are going to charge you for these 3 hours, we'll not charge you anything, and we'll give you 3 additional hours, free additional hours of these services for free. Go enjoy. So there I've seen incidents like that across hyperscalers, and they have their, as you said, they have their full-fledged legal teams who are highly paid. They have all the loopholes, but I mean, talking generally, I mean, still there are SLAs that Microsoft and other cloud providers have to stick with. They just cannot afford to lose customers that are sitting in C and getting flooded.
Yeah, because especially with these outages. Especially with these outages nowadays, like earlier, right, like at least 2 years back, cloud means like it's high availability, every time it is going to be there. But I see a fraction of people nowadays raising concerns.
I haven't seen any outage in Microsoft Azure in last couple of years.
No, not recently happened.
When was it?
That is just it happened for years.
Yeah, I mean, like 4 or 5 months.
Yeah.
How long was it
I
down?
saw one
It's down
for
for
Microsoft 365 recently.
Oh, maybe it's not Azure, maybe it's Snowflake. Okay.
So, the only outage that I have always been frustrated about was 3-4 years ago, before COVID, when Azure AD went down. The challenge with Azure AD was that it was not provisioned across regions, it was not geo-replicated. It was solely running in South Central, and South Central went down. And it just did not brought down Azure Portal and other Azure services. It brought down Outlook, it brought down all Office 365 services, it brought down all the Microsoft ecosystem down, because each of them are integrated with Azure AD for authentication.
I heard like Snowflake is not working, Snowflake is an Azure. So I thought like Snowflake is just services, right? It's just a sub. I thought like I assume.
I mean, I've heard of outages where there are specific regions where specific services go down. The scale at which that Azure AD outage has caused troubles, I've not seen in the last 3-4 years that level of outage.
Complete site outage, right?
Complete site down.
I believe you're talking in 2018, right?
I think it was 2018 or 19 before COVID.
Yeah.
When Azure AD went down, and it was horrible.
But I was working in a company called Lindsay at that time, and the DevOps guy was out, and they said, you're in charge. I had no idea what happened, so I had to call him up. So.
Yeah, I was working on that day too, and people were saying, hey, I can't get into the application. I said, dude, I can't get into Azure Portal either, so what can I do?
Yeah.
So everyone is logged out, so there is nothing to do.
Yeah. But at that time, I was a software developer to begin with, so DevOps was just me knowing stuff around networking, so they gave you, like, you can do it, right?
Even Azure DevOps was down because developers cannot get into Azure DevOps.
Yeah.
Azure AD was down.
Yeah, everything was done, and I was like, I have no idea how to resolve this. Maybe IT needs to get involved.
And actually, Microsoft has started revamping Azure AD architecture, and they have bumped up the SLA support. Earlier, I think it was 99.9, but now they have, I think, added one more 9 to it, and they are trying to geo-replicate in such a way so that if South Central goes down, at least it still keeps operating at a bare minimum level, so that people can get into. I've seen instances since then where people who have already logged into these services, they stay logged on, but any new user cannot log in. But
yeah, what if you lose your connection? Then you're still logged out. Yeah. Yeah, with that, I'll give it back to him so that he can talk more about cloud native.
Thank you, Nick. Great discussion once again. So I do have the SLA screenshots here, and this is downtime based on time. So every week with no nines, you got 1.68 hours, all the way down to 6 seconds with 3 nines. And the idea of why I put this here is because to get the coveted 3 nines, you gotta develop in cloud native. So, for your organization, as I said earlier, every business is different. But for your organization, lift and shift may be better if you are working with PCI data or your core infrastructure or like a banking system or hospital, you can't just turn off everything and turn up everything on in Azure. It's going to be a slow process. And so lift and shift from a developer's perspective, you get to work in, when you do lift and shift, you get to work in familiar territory. You're not just in the cloud now. Maybe you didn't even have any experience in it. So you're still working in your VMs, which are pretty much going to be the same thing. You might be already pinging into a different endpoint, but it's still the same idea. And then from a business perspective, there's a lot less of an initial investment when you do a lift and shift. You don't have to hire a bunch of either contractors or engineers to architect your environments. And there is a time constraint thing. Maybe you don't want to take the amount of time it would take to do it from a cloud native approach. And then you can look at it from a cloud native from a developer's perspective is you get to work with the newest and greatest, which most developers like to do. You get more control over when you're architecting. You get to choose the frameworks, the languages you use, which people do like the control. Then from a business perspective, you hope you can reduce costs overall, probably more upfront. And you also the SLAs. Businesses do love the SLAs. It's going to be a mixed approach, and all migrations are different. Every organization is going to have a different way they have to go about the migration. And as I said earlier, it's really highly dependent on your business. You can have PII data, PCI compliance, and I know you can configure Azure to use those things, but you have to get them certified. And maybe you have some legacy systems that just won't work well in the cloud, or there are some cost considerations your business can't afford the initial investment, or just doesn't want to pay. Time constraints, like I said, and maybe you have third-party applications that also don't work well in the cloud. Anyone else have any other reasons that you couldn't just cloud native your way to any business perspectives?
I think one of the reasons is lock-in. Once you go cloud native, you have to lock in with the platform. So, for example, if I'm going purely cloud native and let's say use Azure function, I am actually signing up for the platform with Azure. I lose my portability, I lock in with Azure. Whereas if I do lift and shift, I can run my workflows in virtual machines with slight modifications across different cloud providers. Whereas if I have to do cloud native, I just cannot take down a function and run it in a Lambda in AWS.
Yep, and that's probably why some companies do a mixed approach too.
Well, to be fair to cloud native, Azure Functions, AWS Lambda, GCP, they are kind of similar, right? Not same, but similar.
Similar, but the programming framework is different, is what I'm saying. And you just cannot run the same piece of code directly in functions that you can run in Lambda. Obviously, containers solve some of that problem where people can implement containers across, but still that lock-in factor still comes in when you go with cloud native. But again, the catch there is if you go with lift and shift, you cannot really leverage the power of cloud platform the way it is supposed to be. You can leverage cloud platforms very much efficiently to go with cloud native.
This gives me an idea. Maybe we need lift and shift software tools for cloud migrations from one cloud to other provider.
We've gone full circle back to on-prem, right? Looking ahead, he kind of just mentioned some of it, but there's a long-term problem with lift and shift. And this context switching is something I find annoying. Is when I have to work on an on-prem server and then work on an Azure thing, it just sometimes gets mixed in the head with the configurations. A lot of the CI/CD gets a little weird. Then there's the ingress and egress. You have to communicate between your on-prem resources and Azure, and that's expensive. It's really expensive. And latency was something that I had heard discussed where it just, the time for your website to communicate to Azure, to communicate to on-prem, to communicate to Azure, it took a while. As long as high latency, especially in real-time apps that need to update in real time. Active Directory is different in Azure. I've noticed that when I was talking with some of the people who work for multiple different clients, they found that they had headaches with Active Directory because it's different in Azure than it is on-prem a lot of the time with the configuration general security, if you do a lift and shift and you do it in a hurry, you might leave some security holes. The short-term problem with cloud native is initial investment. A lot of times there isn't the talent pool available in their area, and they have to hire contractors. They don't want to pay that, or they have to go on large recruiting. They have to spend a lot on recruiters, and it's also the time constraints. It takes a lot longer to do the cloud native approach. You got to really re-architect your applications, and you got to have that all developed. So.
For Active Directory, doesn't AD seem like alleviate that? Or?
It might. When I was talking with some of the architects in my area, they told me that it was a lot different. Not a lot, but it was different, and a lot of times you can't just port it over. But can you just sync Active Directory? Does it?
You can sync Active Directory with Azure AD.
We do that
Okay.
with most of our clients.
But you have to understand that identities still remain separate. You have your on-premises identities and your cloud identities, but they sync between each other.
Oh,
You
okay.
enable things like SSO and other things.
Okay. Yeah.
And then the
I wonder-
confusion is when you say Active Directory and Azure Active Directory, their architecture is very different. It's not like just a cloud version of Active Directory.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just a tool they offer to sync between them.
Yeah, there is a tool called Azure AD Connect. I think they now launched Azure Cloud Sync, Azure AD Cloud Sync or something, which is replacing AD Connect. But it's an agent, you can install it on your Active Directory domain server and get it set up and it syncs automatically.
I mean, IAM is itself a beast, and we have engineers for that, right? That
It is.
yes, specifically do IAM management or access management.
It is. I mean, and I've seen organizations who execute specific projects to get their identities synced with AD. There are so many things that go in consideration.
Good call, thank you. And so what I feel like I've really learned a lot in my research of this is just migrate with cloud native in mind. Getting into cloud can be good for your current labor pool because of you're getting them experiencing cloud. It's just training just by being in it. And eventually you want to aim for that sustainability and those cost reductions, but you should set up your migration to help with the cloud native approach. It's going to most likely be a mixed approach. Unless you're a new business, maybe then you could start a cloud native. But set up your Active Directory. I guess they're syncing now. Security networking in a way that will help you more easily convert your monolith systems to microservices and cloud native using the cloud. So is there any other points of discussion or questions? Because that is all I have.
So what's your recommendation? We should use cloud native or
Oh man, I need to see your business. Definitely just go back to on-prem for sure. Go buy your own servers.
Job security.
So there are a couple of things that people ask on Teams. Brett asked, I am curious what changes you see might be needed in regards to operation activities and supporting those applications that migrated. Do roles shift or change in any way? I have no idea which slide he was referring to.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I also.
Brett, if you're still on call, do you want to come unmute yourself and maybe ask the question?
Sure, I can give it a try. It's a little noisy where I'm at, but can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I guess I was just curious, as you migrate things to the cloud, do the roles of supporting those applications change? Oftentimes you see on-prem centralized operations teams that manage applications, but as you get into the cloud, sometimes you decentralize and those applications because they all don't need to be in one central location with the way the cloud works. And I just wondered if you saw roles change as a result of migrating those applications to the cloud, operations and even development folks maybe doing different roles at all, or what you saw for supporting those applications moving forward in the cloud, or did it not change?
Yeah, great question, Brett. We got it. So, you wanna go ahead and answer?
Oh, sorry. From what I've seen, they do. They absolutely have changed. At least I see cross-functional teams way more commonly. All those the client I worked for when we were there, they were doing their migrations, and one of the big things was all their teams changed from you own this specific application to now you can get asked to do anything. So I do see that. Nick, do you have any?
I mean, it also depends on how you're managing your roles, I guess. So it's very subject. As we were saying at the beginning of this, is that it's very subjective to your organization and your idea organization within your company. But what we have seen, as Julian was pointing out, with our client that we currently work on, you become from being siloed to a project. Now you're all over the place because you have access to everything that the cloud can offer.
Any other experiences? Is that what most people have seen?
Yeah, I mean, the one example to add is like we use the Cosmos database, like for the, I mean, the way we have DBAs, and the thing comes in when Cosmos developers, it's a developer friendly database, right? I mean, now SQL, they spin a container and database and the container, and they push all the JSON data. That's it. I mean, it's completely managed by developers. I mean, again, for the performance, partitioning, there are some things they need to come to DBAs, but most of the things they can manage behind the screen. So as you said, like roles are still shifting. I mean,
I think with cloud DevOps has really come up to the top, but I think that has also created problems.
Yeah.
Where the lines have blurred between what's the responsibility of the dev, what's the responsibility of ops guy.
It's going to be challenging.
It's going to be challenging, and as you were saying, I think it's purely dependent on each organization, how they are organized and what works for them. And in my personal experience, I've always seen where developers have way too much access in cloud platforms where they can go into whatever they want to, and then you have to go and clip their feathers to tell them, hey.
Especially like a development they can do, but when you go to QA and production, just make sure what they did. And
even in depth challenges, developers don't understand when they spin up a database, it's costing money to the organization. So they will spin it up, they will play with it, and then forget to delete it.
I mean, I think at that point, that's not the developer's fault. That is the organization that is letting them allow him to do that.
Yeah,
you should you can have in your Azure cloud instance, right? You can have a sandbox that deletes everything after maybe 48 hours, and you can play in the sandbox. Because personally, being a developer, I like my sandboxes. Please don't take them away from me.
I agree with you. I mean, unless if someone is not letting them to experiment, how can they progress and do it? So basically, it has to be free. At the same time, there should be some guardrails.
Yeah.
Like just doing
housekeeping stuff, right? I mean, hey, something's spinning. Money is charging just send it. Charge $5, $10. I mean, this kind of colors.
Yeah. I mean, as long as I'm gonna guess this, the IT's job to manage that and say, hey, we are gonna have some guardrails against how much you can do in here, what you can do with it. So, you have guardrails against prod. I'm not gonna say your dev guy is gonna have all access to prod, especially for the company I'm working. You can only access prod as long as you have access for 24 hours. I think you have to make an IT request. It goes through and you have 24-hour access to look at prod databases, right? In cloud that you were working on with 118 project.
Oh yeah, that was annoying to request every day when I had testings for weeks.
Yeah, there's a thing called CyberArk.
They do use CyberArk for SA account management. So yeah.
Sorry to cut short, but I guess that answers Brett's question.
Cool.
There is one more question that Brett asked. How do you manage individuals, teams deploying, creating infra in spokes while having another team in charge of setting the connectivity firewall rules?
in VPN hub with Azure firewall? How does the request for opening the ports in the main Azure firewall work? When distributed teams can deploy into this ports? I think he's trying to ask around hub and spoke model
Yeah.
and how responsibilities between networking team and security team who manages firewalls and is managed maybe.
So my easiest answer to that would be for resource groups. You can designate a resource group that says you can do pretty much only these things in that resource group. So you have essentially you would create a virtual network within your thing and then give the resource group naming like you can only use these firewalls or you can only use this network security protocols, right? NSGs. With like the best example I can come up with right now is there is a client I'm helping with where we are trying to connect a different part of the server to a different part of the world so it's between two continents and we're trying to do IPsec tunneling while using VPN as the backbone for it. With that, we are using spokes, but essentially the networking team or the security team is the one opening the ports for us as we request, also opening the subnets, because with with Azure, you need a lot of subnets, especially when you're doing tunneling. Like if you want to do a VPN tunneling between things, you need /27 for at least Azure to have reserves so that they can have redundancies for that tunneling port. Does that answer your question, Brett? Or kind of answers your question?
I guess so, maybe
it's a challenging situation.
Yeah.
And also, in general, Azure gives very granular level of roles.
It does, but specifically I've seen in organizations the port opening and firewall is controlled by security teams, whereas the networking is controlled by operations. And there is always operations teams will set up your resources and network and everything, but still you will not be able to access it because the ports are closed. And to get those ports open, you have to create tickets and get it approved by security teams, which is a hassle in itself.
But even in the current organization structure without the cloud, so security is always maintained.
There will be the same workflow. I mean, I don't see any.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hope that answers your question, Brett. And I think there is nothing else on the chat. They did respond to your questions that you were asking. So I think John has used database migration service. So.
And on the same topic, does it changes when we use public or private cloud, even with Azure? Because right now our Azure is running
security requirements doesn't change.
Yeah.
I mean, if you will think about it, security requirements remains the same across the board.
Mm-hmm.
If there's a bank, they have to comply with FedRAMP and PCI and whatnot, and those regulations apply wherever you are running your software assets. It could be in your own premises, it could be private cloud, public cloud, wherever it could be.
But even with Azure, right, we are running software public and we are going to private, complete cloud. So we are switching in another couple of weeks.
Yeah.
So there are, one example is earlier when you're in the public cloud, right? When folks are working from home, sometimes the firewall, when they change the router, we assign the firewall for the database, set a particular port, the IP, and when the router changes, for example, they reboot the router, the IP address and immediately we need to do. Now going to private, I think we were told we haven't.
I think that's one of the common problems even operation teams faces, because when you're talking about on-premises, they have more control. Whereas as you start moving towards public cloud, you lose control over some of these aspects, and that is one of the frustration points for most of the infra and operations teams and security teams as well. I've seen hesitation in security teams where they don't really trust cloud providers when they claim we comply with all these regulations. They don't trust them. I've come across CISOs who will ask, hey, when I will present it to them that, hey, we can run these Azure policy initiatives, it gives us a secure score that we are running. all these things. They said, no, I don't trust this thing. I want to run my own policies and reports and ensure everything is. So there is still that lack of trust. So.
I mean, to be fair to that, that's the reason Azure recommends you do port, not IP-based filtration, right? Because with ports, you can be anything. Your dynamic router changes your dynamic IPs, but since you have only that port, you can be like, I want to attack the port. So
I think in his particular example in SQL Server database, when you're provisioning, they have a firewall and they don't let you just specify port. You have to specify specific IP address from which you can access that SQL database. And the problem is I have seen that many times because I work from home and I use Fox, which keeps on changing my public IP every other week. And I have to raise tickets with my clients when I'm supporting them on their SQL databases, and they're like, dude, why don't you get a static IP?
Yeah. That's not going to happen. Not at least for like personal use.
But
I tried.
Anyone connecting to this networks, I mean, they should come through the VPN, right? Like when
I mean, many times, but there are scenarios where they don't have VPN, so we can directly connect to Azure portal and manage their resources through Azure portal. But the challenge is, as soon as I try to connect to them through SQL Server Management Studio or Data Studio on my system, it pops up, you don't have access or IP is not added.
maybe is the trend not changing? I mean, like in initial days, since the cloud is not adopted that much, maybe people might have gone.
I mean, in a nutshell, it's still a IP-based firewall on SQL databases. So I think the point here is, as you move to, I mean, you can control all your IP ranges when you are private, but as you move to public, your public IP doesn't have to be static. So when you are connecting to those databases, your public IP can change dynamically, and you can't just keep updating your firewall rules every time. And I have raised it several times with my clients because there has been folks who connected through their home, who were full-time employees who connected to these databases through their IP addresses. And then they left the organization, and God knows those IP addresses still sit on that firewall, and God knows if a Starbucks has got that IP address or anyone.
Correct.
And it's just an IP-based authentication in the firewall, so anyone who is connecting to that public IP can, if they have, I mean, they might not know credentials to connect to database, but technically speaking, that IP address still has access to that database.
I mean, in the process, still they go through VPN, but right now the thought is a couple of weeks we are going to complete private cloud, then this situation won't come to picture. And that's that, it's all going to go over a range. They will open it and then it's complete private.
I have a question for that then. Why not just do some kind of tunneling where your DB on your private is staying static, but if you point it to a domain name, you can then just, it doesn't matter your dynamic IP changes because you're going to hit the domain. The domain is always going to be associated with an IP address, and you can just then tunnel it to whatever your SQL server is on.
SQL database firewall still takes IP address. It only takes IP address. That's the challenge there.
Cider range or just static?
It can take cider range, but that's the only challenge. It doesn't take domain name. But you can actually have private endpoints hooked up into Azure SQL so that your resources sitting within VNet can access to. And SQL databases are a mess because they provide a checkbox which says you can give access to all the Azure services, which essentially means if my database is running in Azure and if I by mistake check that checkbox, then if you are running your services in Azure, by default your Azure service gets access based on that IP because it opens up all the IP address ranges in Azure. It's just kind of messed up.
Like kind of security, right?
They can overcome that one with the Bastion. I mean, like
Bastion cannot connect to databases. Bastion can be used to connect to virtual machines.
Yeah, but database will be on. Okay.
It's a managed database. It's PaaS.
What I understand is just put your database in a virtual machine and let it.
That's a different story. That's what many companies do.
Yeah, so that's what we did in 2018 for a company.
I mean, there are ways. I mean, I have used private endpoint to restrict that database only to VPN, no matter who adds their IP addresses. Till that time, it doesn't come from virtual network. It doesn't let the user in. But I mean, those are sometimes it appears to be more of a workaround than a simple solution.
But it's weird, I mean, like especially still they are going by the IP address as you mentioned in that
And
example.
again, Microsoft doesn't claim that it's a foolproof security solution. They still tell you to go and use Azure AD authentication on those databases so that even if someone comes from those IP address, you should still have a strong identity workflow to connect to those databases. So we are not talking about that, who is authenticated to use database. What we are saying is that database code is still accessible over those IP addresses.
Yeah.
So if I have a public IP address which gets assigned by Fox to you tomorrow, technically you can connect from your system to that.
That's it.
by any chance, if you are able to hack into my system and you get credentials, you can use your IP address and play with my database.
It was more risky.
Yes, secret injection.
So
It is interesting, people are still using.
it is frustrating, and one of my CISOs I got with was very frustrated on this. He was like, "What the heck this product is? Why didn't they need a solution?" But it is how it is.
But VPN is not too costly. I don't know,
No, VNet is not costly. I think
I mean VPN. So if we can force them through VPN, it is easy.
I mean,
just
but
add the
many
same
times what
application.
happens is you are not only coming through your own premises, sometimes you have your applications running in Azure, which connect to databases, so you still have to put them in VNet and then connect to them. I mean, for on-premises resources too, you can have that IP set tunneling and you can force them to come through VPN or express routes maybe. But yeah, anyways, we are over time, 7:40. I think it was a good discussion. Hey, thanks everyone who joined us online. Thank you so much for joining.
Thanks, folks. That's good discussion.
Thank you, Julian.